Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome author Annie Jacobsen, on the release of Nuclear War, A Scenario. Annie Jacobsen is the author of Pulitzer Prize finalist in history, The Pentagon's Brain, the New York Times bestseller Area 51, and Operation Paperclip, and other books. She was a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Times Magazine, a graduate of Princeton University, and lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 2 sons. Annie will be in conversation with Lieutenant General Charlie Moore and John Wolfsthal. Lieutenant General is a highly decorated retired Lieutenant General in the United States Air Force who is recognized as one of the most influential and impactful senior cyber leaders and aviators within the United States military. John Wolfsthal is the Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists. He is a former Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Annie Jacobsen, Lieutenant General Moore, and John Wolfsthal.
Hi. Yes? Okay, great. The last thing you want to do is give somebody in Washington a microphone, especially somebody named John Wolfsthal. Let me say how thrilled I am to be here. My name is John Wolfsthal. I'll be your master of ceremonies for this evening. I'm pleased to introduce Annie Jacobsen and General Charlie Moore. I will turn to General Moore in a minute to give a bit of his own background. First rule of Washington, don't give a mic. Second rule of Washington, know who you're listening to and where they're from and what they're selling. So I'm very transparent about that. I've been working on nuclear issues since I was a teenager in New York City. I currently work at the Federation of American Scientists. Hi, Hans. My colleague at the Federation of American Scientists, who's cited frequently in the book. And it's an organization that was founded in 1946 around the importance of science and technology influencing policy. And for those of you that have seen Oppenheimer, a number of the people that worked on the Manhattan Project were the ones that founded the Federation of American Scientists out of that belief that you can't just leave weapons to the policy people. There has to be a connection between technology and policy. And a big part of the way we do that is through promoting transparency and civic engagement. The secrecy system that exists in the United States was built out of the Manhattan Project. Nuclear weapons were born secret. There are certain reasons why that is the case, and there are certain reasons why that's a good thing, but there's a lot around this complex that are secret that we don't agree with and we actually think should be available to the public, how much it costs, where the material might spill into a river, how many we have. And those are things that we work very hard to create transparency around and also to get people's attention. And for 30 years, after the end of the Cold War, people like me and people like Amy Wolf and people like Hans Christensen and people that have been following this issue have been jumping up and down saying, this is important, right? These things didn't just magically disappear in 1991, pay attention. Well, we have your attention now for a number of reasons. And we're really glad we do because into that we have Annie's book, which is a remarkable piece of work. I don't mean you're a remarkable piece of work, Annie, although I think you probably qualify too. I'm sure a number of you are here because of Annie's previous work. You will not be disappointed in her latest because of the level of detail and the meticulous research that went into this. I joked previously in the green room, it's not a book, it's a dissertation. And there's a PhD that could easily go with this. I've read dissertations that don't have this level of detail or accuracy. And so for those of you just getting your hands on the book, one, don't read it right before you go to bed. And two, it is truly a remarkable piece of scholarship. But beyond that, it is accessible. No offense, Hans. We write things all the time for a very limited audience, right? The nuclear nerds in the room. I don't see that many, or maybe one or two. But to make something accessible to the general public about a subject that's scary, that often seems beyond you, is a really difficult, challenging thing to do and is a real talent. And so that's why there are people that blog and give quotes, and then there are people who are talented writers and actually produce books. And so we have that with Annie. What we're gonna do tonight is I'll interview both General Moore and Annie for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. And then you should all line up rapidly to buy a copy of Annie's book and have it signed. And she can sign it to your grandkids or your dog or whatever you really want. I'm also going to start off with I think maybe it's not the greatest praise I can give you, but for an author, it's the greatest praise. I have another book up here. For those of you that aren't nuclear geeks, this is Making the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It is the Bible. If you take a class in college or graduate school about nuclear weapons or the history of nuclear weapons in the Cold War, this is the book. It starts with the discovery of the atom and goes all the way through the Manhattan Project in detail about how they figured it all out. This is the greatest book on nuclear weapons ever written. This is the best book I've read since this. There are lots and lots of books out there, including Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, which we'll get to, which is a great book, but is not a compelling read. It's a real slog, for lack of a better term. So I'm not diminishing the book. You should buy a copy. It's great. Marty was a friend of mine. So, okay, enough about me. General, let me just ask you in a couple of minutes to summarize your background so people will know where you're coming from, and then we're going to interrogate Annie.
Sure. Thanks, John. So it's great to see everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Support a fantastic book and an author who I've enjoyed, like I'm sure many of you. Just curious, has anyone actually had a chance to read the book? I know it just came out yesterday. Has anybody dove right in? Okay, that's actually good because we're going to make you very interested in it as we talk about this today. But my name is Charlie Moore. I retired from the U.S. Air Force in October of 2020 after 33 years serving. I was raised a military brat. So became very interested in serving. My father was a helicopter pilot in the Army. I wanted to go a lot faster than helicopters go, so I went to the Air Force Academy, became an F-16 pilot. I spent about 25 years really focused on the flying business inside the Air Force. In fact, as you read in the book, I'll tell you one of the locations, Aviano Air Base, F-16 base, is one of the places I had the pleasure of being stationed and being a squadron commander. After that 25 years, I saw a real divergence happen in my career. It wasn't necessarily out of choice. People are often surprised to find out the more senior you get, and at this point in my career as a one-star general, the less input you actually have on what you're going to do and where you're going to go. And I was asked at that point to come and work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on the Joint Staff, and one of the portfolios I was handed was cyber. So you can imagine knuckle-dragging F-16 pilot being told, and this is 2014, early 2015, figure out how this cyber world is supposed to work, amongst other things that I had responsibilities for, like electronic warfare and space, information operations, and a lot of the sensitive relationships we have with other governmental organizations. So I did that job for a few years, thought I was going to be going back into the flying business, but instead I was called by the director of the National Security Agency, a guy named Admiral Mike Rogers at the time, and he said, I think we're going to be building this organization called U.S. Cyber Command into a combatant command, which is one of now 11 organizations that actually do the warfighting for the U.S. Department of Defense, and this would be responsible for cyber. Will you come up and help us set up the operations and be my director of operations? And I thought he'd called the wrong guy, quite frankly. But I had been working with him and his staff in that job on the Joint Staff, and so he, dealing with cyber, and so he had me come up, and I ran operations for Cyber Command for 3 years, beginning in 2018 when we elevated to be a combatant command. And at the end of that, I was asked by the new commander, General Paul Nakasone, who just retired as the director of the National Security Agency and commander of U.S. Cyber Command, if I would be the deputy commander for 2 years. So I did that job then. Relevant to today, other than just the F-16 time, I spent some time at NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, that plays a very important role in the decisions that get made and the information that gets passed to the senior decision makers anytime we have an event like is described in this book. And then also had the opportunity, of course, in the National Military Command Center working for the chairman on the Joint Staff, and then as the director of ops and the deputy commander at Cyber Command to be on those phone calls when we're actually practicing and having to make the decisions that Annie does such a great job representing.
Great. Thank you. So, Annie, look, I got stuck with this at a young age, right? I started at 13. I eventually failed upward, eventually working for President Obama as the senior director at the National Security Council and this stuff. But you had a choice. You didn't have to go into nuclear weapons. You've written some great books about things that people care about, like aliens, and why a book on nuclear weapons?
First of all, thank you both for joining, and thank you all for being here and the interest in a book, and thank you for that lovely sales pitch for my book. I really appreciate it.
I don't get a percentage at all.
But and I do hope people read it, and I have been told it is like, don't read it at night, except for I did read it at night, and now my wife's angry at you because I stayed up all night. But the way that I came to this book, I am the author before this book, I had written 6 books, all of which deal with the Pentagon, the CIA, military and intelligence programs. And each book has, let's say, 100 some odd sources going back to the early days of the Cold War, World War II even. And I cannot tell you how many people said to me, sources of mine, with pride, I dedicated my life to preventing nuclear World War III, and I'm proud that I did that. And during the fire and fury rhetoric of the previous administration, I began to think, my God, what happens if prevention, or it's known in the nuclear command and control world as deterrence, fails? What happens if deterrence fails? And I took that question to my most senior sources, top-tier advisors, people that you see here, and others, and former secretaries of defense. It was COVID. A lot of people had a little more time for me than I might otherwise have had the great fortune. And the book began to build from that. And what I learned shocked me. Not just once, not every interview I found out something shocking. Back in the green room, we were discussing another detail we may get to that shocked me. And so wrapping it up with this, I am not an expert like the two of you are in your different professions. I'm a journalist, I'm an investigative reporter, I'm a storyteller. And it's my job to bring the information to the people. And what I like to do is do it in the most compelling way possible, because that's what gets people's attention.
Well, I hadn't used the word compelling, but I think it's right on the money. And when you read the book, you'll see you're basically on a countdown. You're on a clock. A lot of the work is, as you just talked about, is spent making sure nuclear weapons never get used. How do we control these things? How do we secure them? But my work and the work of a lot of people that I know basically ends when the button gets pushed. And so your book basically begins at that point. And I think it was, for me, remarkable having worked with people both in government who knew the system and outside government who worked very hard to find out how the system worked to make it transparent. I guess I'd have a question for you, Charlie, which is, are you surprised she got all this stuff? I mean, I don't think there's anything in the book that's classified, but that being said, if I had an active clearance or you had an active clearance, you couldn't say this. Right? So it's a very weird world. I just wonder how you think about that.
I was surprised and I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised because it's Annie Jacobsen. And if you've read her other works, she puts in the time and the effort to do the research and talk to the people, some on the record, some off the record, to get it right, which is one of the reasons why I'm here, other than being her friend, is because I appreciate authors that try to educate the public and go to the links that she does. Now, at the same time, I was surprised because, as I alluded to before, I've been on the other side of participating in those phone calls in those tests and those training scenarios that we obviously spent a lot of time going into. And the level of detail and precision which she brings to the reader about what's going on is absolutely remarkable. And I've never seen anybody come close to it.
So Annie, let's get into that. I mean, you just sort of teased us that you had all these interviews and you were shocked. You can look, I mean, the bibliography is now what I'll steal and make available for my classes. Amy, I suggest you do the same. And the people that you interviewed is a who's who, of people that have been involved in these fields for a long, long time. So give us a couple of things that really did shock you.
So to begin with, what's also interesting is a lot of people say like, I cannot believe you got all this information. The great majority of it is on the public record. You just have to dig deep and find it, and in fact know what you're looking for. And I think one of the things about nuclear weapons is that so much of it is reserved to like sort of very erudite people that really have dedicated decades to studying this, and there's a kind of distancing between them and just the rest of us. And I tried to break down that barrier, which I do by asking a lot of questions. There is no such thing as a dumb question. And I do go to the smartest people in the room or the smartest people in the world to get the answers, because they're the ones who kind of tend to follow. And I'm talking about the Nobel laureates and the retired secretaries of defense and the retired Stratcom commanders. They almost all adhere to this sort of Einstein principle that you should be able to explain it to a kid. And that's essentially my job, is to be able to, see what is mysterious and then break it down. But let me just give you a really quick overview. The most important thing, I think, to understand what we're talking about is the time, is the speed at which nuclear war would happen. That's the first shocking moment. And to understand that in really simple terms, you just have to know 30-second wrap-up of a ballistic missile, which is that a ballistic missile takes 30 minutes to get from one continent to another. It's actually 33 minutes from Pyongyang, 26 minutes and 40 seconds from Moscow. These kind of things are in seconds. And because of that, this is not like a 9/11 type attack. There's no, oh my God, the planes just hit the Pentagon. The reality is that, and we have people here who know this from inside baseball of it all, is that in the first fraction of a second of the launch of a ballistic missile, a satellite system in space, ours is called SBIRS, the Space-Based Infrared Satellite System, incredible piece of technology, 1/10 of the way to the moon, in geosync, parked over enemy nations, sees the spark of the hot rocket exhaust on an ICBM, and it's 30 minutes until it's going to strike the continental United States. And we are all sitting around, going to books, talks, doing our jobs, walking our dogs, playing with our children. And if that is happening, people like General Moore and the rest of the people that are involved in nuclear command and control are on it. And that is how I write out the scenario in seconds and minutes. And learning that was the first shock. And then in a way, it became an easier book to write. Certainly the format became evident. The book is in 3 acts, 24 minutes, 24 minutes, 24 minutes, then it's over. The former commander of Stratcom, General Keeler, said to me when we were discussing this, yes, Annie, the world could end in a few hours. And so that kind of urgency and expediency of it all made the reporting of this a lot easier than one would think, because you pretty much had to say, and then what happens? Yeah.
Well, and then what happened? So it's a great segue, because we were talking about this before. There's a tension in the book because it's all built around time. And General, you've been at NORAD and obviously helped run simulations about what the process would have to be like. I've been at the other end of that, where I'm sitting at the National Security Council on my JWIC system, and an email pops up. There's a national decision conference because the Commander of Strategic Command has detected through this network, and you've got to decide, and then a minute later be like, okay, we're pulling down the conference, right? It turns out it's just a space launch vehicle, or it's just a short-range rocket. But then you go through the simulations, but that time aspect has 2 real big implications. One is all of the systems have to work really well. Anybody who has a home security system or has trouble with their phone knows that even simple systems don't always work well. And when you have multiple overlapping systems, getting them to work seamlessly is hard. And then the most flawed system is a human being. And I was struck by one particular aspect as you were talking, as your book developed, which is the tone that was taken by commander of strategic command or by military advisors to the president in forcing a decision. You've got to decide now. I have a colleague at Princeton University, Sharon Weiner, who has written this phenomenal virtual reality program called The Biscuit. You can actually go to thebiscuit.org and see the story about it. And she actually puts her grandmother's biscuit recipe on the back of the card. The biscuit is the unique identifier code that the president carries with him everywhere so that he can verify who he is if he wants or she wants to launch a nuclear weapon. But in the simulation, the commander of strategic command is yelling at the person going through the simulation. And so I'm curious why you wrote it that way. Was it just natural? Did you get anecdotes that suggested? And then, General, I wonder how that struck you, because obviously we practice this. We do it all the time so you can be cold and calculating and thoughtful and rational. But a simulation is a simulation and reality is reality, and it's hard to combine the two. So turn it over to you for response.
Okay, I'll answer, and then I'd love to hear what you. So, every time that you have a character in the book, the nonfiction reported scenario, making a decision, if you want to really nerd out, you go to the back of the book and to the notes, and you can see what that interview is based upon, right? So when the Secret Service has a big problem, it's, oh, this is what the Secret Service director told me based on this kind of situation happening. So in the instance you're referring to, where the president has to make a decision, that was an interview I did with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. We did a series of interviews. Perry is now in his 90s, and he's, it's very interesting to think of someone who has spent their entire life dedicated to military strength, reflecting upon these concepts and ideas as an older person. And so that's a really interesting text to take into consideration. But in this situation, he felt, and he conveyed to me that as Secretary of Defense, you are the civilian advisor to the president. And while the president has sole launch authority, meaning he does not have to have permission from anyone to launch nuclear weapons, he's going to turn to his SecDef to ask advice. And the SecDef is the civilian that's going to perhaps have that perspective versus the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Again, president doesn't need his permission, but is going to ask advice. And so the difference of the military perspective from the civilian perspective might lead to one having an impression of another. But you were hands-on in those situations. How did you feel that? Do you feel that this idea of jamming the president, as the sort of civilian side always says, do you think that's legitimate, or do you see it?
I do think it's legitimate. A lot of it has to do with the personalities of the people that would be involved in a real situation. But even in the training environments, obviously that can come out. You have to understand that when this happens, whether it's training or, God forbid, real world, the person that's coming into one of these conferences with the least amount of information is the person that has to make the decision. The hardest decision that any human's ever had to make. They have the least amount of information. And so a lot of time is spent trying to figure out how to communicate to someone coming into a situation blind with brevity and clarity. Again, about the most important decision that a human being will make. And so I think the way that Annie depicts it in the book is extremely realistic. In fact, having sat through a lot of these, but then I never thought of it this way, but then when I read the way she wrote it, it really made me think about this aspect of it. A lot's been written about nuclear conflict and what happens afterwards, and nuclear winter and all those things. And in fact, I'm old enough, anybody remembers that show The Day After that came out in the 80s? It was huge, right? But it mainly dealt with what happens after. Not only have we talked about how well, John, you laid it out well, she captures this compressed timeline and all the systems and the architecture that's involved, but she captures the human element of this, which is really, really interesting. Scary, right, but very interesting. And I think what you really see in real life, and is portrayed very well in the book, is you have a president that basically experiences the 5 phases of grief, not in many months, like when you just found out you have a terminal illness or you've lost somebody, but within about 6 minutes. Because the first thing, and you see this depicted in the book, is denial. There's no way this is a test, right? This is an unscheduled test you guys are putting me through. No, this isn't a test. What's the next phase of denial? Anger, right? Nobody would ever do this. Who the hell would launch this knowing that we're going to wipe them off the face of the earth and kill all these people, right? Then you get into bargaining. Well, maybe it doesn't have a nuke on it. Maybe it's just going to land in Washington, D.C., like all our systems are telling us, but it's just an ICBM. It doesn't have a nuke on it. You see that in the book, right? Then it becomes depression. There's going to be hundreds of millions of people that are about to die. Whichever decision I make, it doesn't matter. There are going to be hundreds of millions of people that are about to die. And then there's finally acceptance. I do have to make a decision. Because not making a decision is one, right? Which is why I think you do see the jamming that takes place sometimes with somebody like Stratcom Commander, because he has a specific duty and job to fulfill that requires a decision by the president.
Yeah, it's in this work that this is part of this is known as the always never problem. Nuclear weapons should never be used unless they've been given the proper authorization, but they always have to be ready to go. And if the president gives the order, and so that tension is an extremely difficult one. I always think back to the not always great nuclear dramas in the 70s and 80s, where the last surviving military advisor is always some crazy colonel. And he's advising the Secretary of Agriculture, flying around on a doomsday plane, because in the order of succession, if the president dies and the chairman dies, and you work down the line, the continuity of operations can devolve pretty quickly. And we're in Washington, we know when they do the State of the Union address, there's always one cabinet secretary that isn't there. That's why. It's not like some quaint little tradition. It's so if everybody dies, there's somebody who can still push the nuclear button. I went straight to anger, actually, Charlie, because you destroyed in the book my retirement town of San Luis Obispo, which I'm still quite angry about, but I'm going to look over that. So another little piece of the book that struck me is just remarkable. For those of you who care, it's on page 263. You have this little aspect that most people in our day-to-day work don't. I love people are going to the page number. Turns out North Korea's got a nuke floating around in space, and they decide to detonate it to create a giant electromagnetic pulse to short out American space-based communication. And when the news came out last month that we were worried that Russia was about to launch this, did you go like, man, I am smart, or like, damn, they're going to blow the book? Like, we.
I mean, I went like, oh my God, I cannot believe this is actually happening. But so there's a part in the book in there's a moment in sort of Shakespearean terms or Hollywood terms in the 3-act structure, which is called All is Lost. And there is certainly that point in the book, and it's in the last act, the 24 minutes, and then of course there's the coda, which is nuclear winter. But in that all is lost moment, North Korea does launch an EMP weapon, which is already in space. And it's interesting that you bring that part up, because I had to drill down on not just the fact checking, but the re-interviewing of all the players in that part of the book so many times, because and I'm not going to give it away because it's so horrific what happens, and that it is all science-based and all fact-based, and do look at the notes. And anyone who read the book, from my editor to people who are not familiar with it, to those who read the book, these are advanced readers who are sort of very political-minded, pointed out to me that issue has become so politicized, right? So an EMP in space is a very real threat, at least to my research in reporting. And over the decades, the past 2 decades, this has come to the fore. There were kind of a group of people. I interviewed the former CIA analyst, Dr. Peter Pry, who was the head of the commission, and he was sort of marginalized as too much of a hawk, and this must be Washington's way to try to get money for this, and so all the people on the other side of the aisle became, this is not a threat, this is just hyperbole, and I had to find my way through that to the science. And the science is horrific. And the really who I went to on those little anecdotes here about my own reporting was this trying to go to the smartest guys in the room. a really interesting set of interviews I did was with Richard Garwin. He's now 95. He was sort of 91 and 2 and 3. And this bomb on the cover of this book is a 10.4 megaton thermonuclear weapon called Ivy Mike. And Richard Garwin drew the plans. So Edward Teller is often called, rightly so, the father of the hydrogen bomb. But Garwin drew the plans. He was 23, 24 at the time. And so you could argue that Richard Garwin knows more about nuclear weapons than anyone. And he certainly knows more about policy because as a founder of the NRO, as a founder of many of these organizations, some of which he says, I still can't tell you. So they're still classified organizations within organizations. Garwin took me through up to the razor's edge of what can be known about EMP weapons because he wrote the first paper on it back in the 50s, and lo and behold, it's still classified. And likewise, General Toohill, one of your colleagues, who was the first cyber director, Obama's cyber director, he also gave me a lot of information about EMPs, and lo and behold, his paper written in the 80s is still classified. And so the result is that is a very serious threat. To hear that the Russians have perhaps, or are thinking of launching that, is mind-boggling. And I feel like that's like a real bummer now that you know that. When you get to that point of the book, if you had trouble sleeping before, you will really have a rough time.
That's the bummer, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I'm laughing because one, Amy and Hans, my colleagues who live in this world, were nodding because we also agree Dick Garwood's probably the smartest guy we've met. But also Hans is taking notes because Hans has built his career in part on the Freedom of Information Act and FOIAing all of this information, which probably shouldn't be classified anymore, but is just because we classify everything. And so it'll be a good thing. You can fill up another closet, Hans, of like, you know. Two more brief questions, and then we're going to turn things over to Q&A from the audience. The first, I have to ask you about it because over the last year, everybody who works on nuclear issues has been hanging their hook on Oppenheimer for lots of different reasons. One, because a lot of us read the book, a lot of us know about Robert Oppenheimer and Manhattan Project and all these issues, but also because we have been fighting to get public attention for this issue. So I'm just sort of curious, like, you know, you're both experts. What do you think of the movie?
Haven't seen it.
What?
Okay. We're going to send you to...
I have not seen it yet. I have not seen it.
Yeah.
Highly recommend it.
Yeah. So I have been working with Los Alamos, or rather trying to work with Los Alamos on, you know, for 15 years now. In all of my books, they have something to do with Los Alamos and nuclear weapons. And I'd always, before recently, had this kind of an attitude from those there, although I'd been to the archives and visited the site and whatnot. And in this reporting this book, there was an entirely different attitude. For example, they declassified the origin story of the president's football on my request for this book. That had never been declassified. It's really interesting where it came from. That's the book that you referred to, The President as the Biscuit, and the football contains the Black Book, which has a sort of condensed version of the nuclear launch plans. The minutes and seconds that you're talking about where the president learns he has to make that decision, your 5 stages of grief. Brilliant description, by the way. I hadn't even thought of that. That is, the football is opened up and the president has all that information in front of him. And so Los Alamos declassified that. And I said to them, you know, off the record, thank you, but why, right? And they said, the Oppenheimer effect. Not the man, but the movie. That the public's interest in nuclear weapons, because of the Oppenheimer film, made Los Alamos realize that transparency could work for them and with them. They suddenly didn't feel like the enemy. And I think that is, if there could be anything I would wish out of this book, along with the Reagan reversal that came about after President Reagan watched the day after and became depressed, reached out to Gorbachev, the wish would be transparency, and thank you, Hans, for all the work you do with the transparency and the interviews that you gave me for this book. You're noted many, many times in the notes and quoted, because that transparency part of it allows for the interface between, you know, the Pentagon, the National Security Council and the rest of us. And that is, to quote President Eisenhower on his outgoing speech, it wasn't just about the military-industrial complex, which he spoke of and is so famously quoted. What he said after that was, a knowledgeable citizenry makes the democracy. And that's what I'm all for, and that's why I write my books.
So it's always very interesting that I've been on the losing end of debates with the people that are responsible for managing nuclear affairs for decades, but they always talk about a consensus. There's a consensus for maintaining a triad of nuclear launch vehicles. There's a consensus for funding these things. But then when you want to have a debate, they're like, well, we don't want to talk about those things. And so that's where we come from as well, which is a lovely segue for actually a public discussion. So we actually have microphones from our hosts at Politics and Prose. If you raise your hand right in front, we'll recognize you and go around, and we'll try to get in as many questions as we can, if we can be brief.
I will be as quick as I can. I have two very quick questions. I'm thinking about, very interested in what you said about the 5 stages of grief, kind of at the presidential level when he's making that decision. I'm also very interested at the staff level, kind of the very first folks to get these calls. These national event conferences can become so frequent as to be mundane, and it can be really easy to get in kind of the cycle of, all right, another one of these, it's just another generic, surface-to-air missile, okay. And the moments that it takes for it to kind of sink in at the staff level, what's happening, the decisions to be made, when do we wake up our principal, and valuable time lost when those decisions, that denial perhaps kicks in. And I'm wondering if you might speak to, what that looks like as, kind of those early decisions are made before it reaches the level of the president. And separately, perhaps in the opposite direction, this sounds really terrifying. Should we all become preppers and start building our bunkers and buying gold bars?
I think the first part of the question is very interesting to hear from you.
Yeah, as is depicted in the book, and we've kind of alluded to a couple times, there's actually not a lot of time. So if there's a missile launch that's detected somewhere on the planet, the systems that Annie does a great job of describing in the book and how they work and how they all work together, they characterize that extremely quickly. And that is followed in short order by the system starting to predict where that particular missile is going to go. So, is it a short-range ballistic missile, medium range, or ICBM? Who's shooting it? What type of missile is it? And so all of that characterization happens pretty quickly. Obviously, if it's a short-range missile that's going to end up going out of North Korea and landing somewhere in the Sea of Japan, obviously that's a bit concerning, but it's not the same thing as if the missile that's picked up is a 17, like it's described in the book, and you start plotting the impact point somewhere in the continental United States. That changes, obviously, everything, and it changes who's going to be called into that conference and how quickly.
And also to clarify, because we were talking about this back there, and there's a map in the book that Richard Garwin and Ted Postal drew for me, and the specs to show. The decision making you're talking about is happening in basically 150 seconds, from launch to the decision point where realizing the missile is going to Hawaii, or San Francisco or the East Coast. And so there's not a lot of time for anything. The second part of it about should we all become preppers, I give you some really horrific details. And again, those are not from Annie Jacobsen's imagination. There are details from documents sourced in the back that defense scientists have spent decades explaining, understanding, learning, and relaying what happens to humans and to things in ring 1, at ground zero, ring 1, ring 2. And so you can make a decision where you want to be.
No, you shouldn't become a prepper.
Yeah.
And what I would say is, just to follow on this, that challenge of always being ready, always characterizing it correctly, is one of the arguments that's being made for why we need to automate this. We already use large language models and automation to integrate a lot of the signals intelligence, but the question about whether that information should go through and be processed by artificial intelligence, how you report that information has been processed by artificial intelligence is an active policy debate right now. So there was another question here in front, and then if people just let me know.
Hello, thank you for being here today. You spoke earlier about transparency, and obviously I think here in the US it's very clear the goal of achieving that. I listened to your a podcast with Lex Friedman, and you mentioned the Russian tundra system and its limitations in detecting sunlight as fires and so forth. And so could you speak more about America's adversaries and their technical limitations and their lack of transparency, and the experts that you spoke to, how they might be dealing with that?
The transparency factor is so critical, and you're speaking of the Tundra system. I mentioned the SIBR system that the Defense Department has, which is just an incredible piece of technology and works. You just really can't even imagine being able to detect a launch in under a second. And because of the concept of parity, in essence, Russia has the same. Although I learned from interviewing the experts in that area that Russia's Tundra system is deeply flawed. And again, went to sort of the world's expert on the Russian military forces, Pavel Podvig, who's the liaison to the UN, to find out, is this just the American defense scientists who say it's flawed? And he confirmed, no, it is really problematic. And the result of that could be, because the problem in the scenario is not just North Korea making an errant rogue launch for reasons we don't know why. It's what happens after, as the president launches a counterattack, and the problem becomes Russia misinterpreting what the United States is doing. And one of those problems links to Tundra. And another one was something Hans Christensen explained to me, that he writes about at length in a monograph, that our ICBMs, so we have 400 ICBMs in silos, our ICBMs do not have enough range to go directly to North Korea. They have to fly over Russia. And if that fact seems astonishing, I had that confirmed from former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, who said to me, and I'm paraphrasing his exact quote is in the book, yes, that is a very serious problem.
Yeah, I'd agree with that statement. That seems like a serious problem. We had a question over here, actually two in a row. So lady in green and then the woman in gray.
Yes, hi. I was wondering how you chose this triggering scenario for the entire book of all the different potential risks and nuclear weapon states. Was this the most likely to you, or was it just one that fascinated you? And I guess, how did you come about choosing that?
It's a great question. So I'm guessing like you're wondering why I didn't use strategic, or tactical nuclear weapons, or let's say a terrorist attack with nuclear weapons. And that's a great question. And both of those situations would probably be very different than when we're talking about ballistic missiles, which is why I explained that in the very beginning, that most people really don't need to know or think they need to know. And it's once you realize a ballistic missile, it's called a strategic missile in sort of Pentagon jargon, not a tactical nuclear weapon, which would be a battlefield weapon, but rather a ballistic missile that cannot be redirected and cannot be recalled. And so that is why the ticking clock scenario comes into play, because you just simply have that 30-minute window. And because of America's policy called launch on warning, the President of the United States is required to make that decision to launch a counterattack. And, again, Bill Perry, if you Google, does America really have a launch on warning policy? You will get a lot of different opinions. Same as, does America really have sole presidential authority? You will get no, we don't. And I promise you.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Yes, we do. Right? And so launch on warning, just like it sounds. We do not wait to absorb a nuclear blow. We launch on warning. And that is why the scenario is set up the way it is.
Please.
So going back to the earlier conversation about how this is an inherently international issue and how our allies and adversaries really play into the picture, when you're writing this book or any of your other books, do you think about how it's going to be received by that international audience? And if not, how do you want it to be received by that international audience?
Great question. We have a mutual friend, Colonel Nutman, who was, that's not his real name, Colonel Chestnut. His call sign is Nutman. But he was a pilot, and he does a lot of things and plays a role in the book. And he read his first reaction answers your question, where he said, Annie, this book should be read by everyone that is in charge of a foreign nation. And he said that coming from the position, not just being a person who's been in government and service and military operations his whole life, but now as sort of a PhD working in the world of nuclear testing. And I think the interesting thing that he said, many of us have a piece of the information, but we don't have the whole picture. And I think that goes to foreign leaders as well. And as you mentioned, those who have to make these incredible decisions, God forbid they happen, are often the least informed. Like the President of the United States, I've learned in reporting it. And so it would be great if people knew in advance how terrible this would all be. And you and I, we all watched The Day After because of our age. We were in high school. But interestingly, the one bit of hope in all of this is President Reagan watched The Day After as well, and he became depressed. That's what he wrote in his presidential notes. And that caused him to reach out to Gorbachev. And because of their communication, the world went from the all-time high in 1986 of 70,000 nuclear weapons to the 12,500 that we have today. That's progress.
There's a question in the back over here.
Thank you for this and all your books you've written. I feel like I have the perfect duo for this. So cyber and cyber threats. It's the present and the unforeseeable future. And the United States, both public and private, has had their fair share of intrusions over the past decade. What threat does that play to our nuclear capabilities, but also maybe specifically to this process of launching on command and that just communication to maybe launch? So if you could both kind of speak to that.
Mm-hmm. That's a you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, there's probably nothing that gets more attention in terms of security, redundancy, resilience, accuracy than NC3, which is Nuclear Command and Control Communication Systems. And for all the reasons that you said and many other reasons as well. So as cyber has become more of a factor, that has obviously factored into exactly how we make sure that we can accomplish all those things. I'm trying to think what else I can tell you because it's obviously a very sensitive area, but that is the number one priority if you were to rank order all the systems that we look to protect from the Department of Defense perspective. It's NC3.
I can give you a good anecdote on that, which is, so the United States is in the process of modernizing all aspects of its nuclear arsenal, including its ground-based ICBMs and the silos and the communication system that's connected with that. But we've had a debate over the last several years. By the way, that's going to cost you about $130 billion over the next 20 years. In rebuilding the silos and the command centers, they're going to switch from the systems that were built in the 1970s, which still run on 5.5-inch floppy disk computer systems. Raise your hand if you've never held a floppy disk, right? Go ahead, you can raise them. We know who you are.
Right.
So one of the debates is, well, should we be doing this? Should we be moving the systems up to the most advanced computer-based systems? They are very fast. We can do more things with them, but they also introduce vulnerabilities. And that's one of the challenges. And there's no right answer here, right? It's smart people trying to figure out, okay, what's the best we can do, but recognizing that the best we can do has to be perfect every time.
I'll add an anecdote that I learned about that, because cyber is this issue that is very at the razor's edge of that cannot be discussed, right, for obvious reasons. But so many of the ballistic missiles are really run by old school systems. For example, and we didn't even talk about this, save it for the book, the submarines that are really known as the handmaidens of the apocalypse for good reason. The ballistic missiles that they fire are guided to the target by star sighting. And I just found that the most remarkable and sort of horrifically poetic concept that, you know, the end of the world would be delivered by this ancient form of navigation. You just imagine like hunter-gatherers, where we would all wind up being, by the way, after nuclear winter, guiding themselves to certain places by the stars, and that's the same as our sub-launched ballistic missiles.
Which makes them really, really accurate, by the way, so for the real geeks. Any other questions? I've got one here, and then Hans will get the last word.
Hi, I wanted to thank you so much for writing this. Really looking forward to reading it. I'm Chase Harward. I'm with the project on nuclear issues. When I was in college, one of the most impactful assignments I think I had was we were assigned to watch the BBC docufilm Threads. It horrified me. I didn't sleep for a week thinking about it. I'm curious, compared to the unapologetically bleak tone of that movie, what similarities or differences in tone does your book have?
I have not seen Threads, and that's a whole.
I'm taking you both to the movies.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
I read books, see? I don't,
That's good. That's good.
You know,
I didn't say I didn't read the book. I said I didn't see the movie.
anything that brings this issue to the public's attention, to me, is a brilliant addition to the discussion, because it has to be a decision for everyone because it affects everyone. You know, the end of the book where I write about nuclear winter, I had the great fortune of interviewing Professor Brian Toon, who is one of the 5 original authors of the nuclear winter theory. His professor, Carl Sagan, was the most famous. And being humble that they were back in 1983, when the Defense Department accused it of being Soviet propaganda, they said, okay, our models are limited, because of course there were floppy disks. But now, with the state-of-the-art climate modeling, and Professor Toon has stayed on this issue for decades, we now know that nuclear winter would be worse. It would be, you know, the soot that got lofted into the atmosphere would block out the sun for 7-10 years. It would be a temperature drop of 40 degrees Fahrenheit in many places. And so agriculture would fail. 5 billion people would die. We would return to a hunter-gatherer state, likely. And so, to your point, anything that brings attention to the matter and has people curious about them, wanting to have these discussions, wondering if we should be spending money on X or Y, wondering, should the president know a little bit more about what he might have to do? Having the president make decisions about whether launch on warning as an executive order is a really good idea or not. I once said to someone, one of the sources I was interviewing, why doesn't Congress do anything more about this? And they said, Annie, Congress only pays attention to what the people are paying attention to.
As a side note, I have a list of 156 movies where nuclear weapons feature, and I'm looking for a really big grant so I can do a podcast on each of the movies, like Mystery Science Theater 3000. So for anybody who sees the post or wants to fund it, and Threads is right up there. It's really good. Hans, you'll get the last question.
Thanks very much, and thanks for an amazing piece of work. I still have to dive into the details, but not that I can't wait, but I've been working on this stuff for 40 years now, and one of the things that really struck me is this transition as we left the Cold War. Back in those days, there was so much emphasis on what they call tactical nuclear weapons, shorter range systems. There was also a lot of concern about it because people really thought that was one of the avenues you could get into the big thing, because things would start to escalate. And how would you be able to control this? And now that we see this uptick in, international competition, strategic competition between Russia, the United States, and China, again, what we also see an uptick in are these suggestions that we somehow need more of these systems, again, that are shorter range tactical, because we need to have the ability to match the other when we start escalating, and then perhaps control escalation and make people back down or something like that. That whole dynamic is really starting to evolve again. And I just wonder if in your interviews with all these people that have been intimately involved in it, other than the time crunch, how do they talk about this idea that you can manage escalation or even control it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to know what the general thinks, because you have more hands-on, but what I will say in my interviews is no one took that position with me. Now, I wasn't speaking to active military, because there's usually a problem with active military talking to someone like me, right? And so I was speaking to people who were former Secretary of Defense, and that gives you a little bit of a different perspective. And I think what I would say to, separate from the interviews, maybe the item that brought what you're asking about home, the clearest to me was the declassified Proud Prophet war game. And I have a image in the book, and if you want to know what a declassified nuclear war game looks like from the Pentagon, first you'll be shocked because it's just all black. It's like one word and one page number, and it's all black. And you think, well, what good does this do? Well, the good that it does is it allows someone like Professor Paul Bracken, who was there, to be able to speak about it in a general way. And what he said was, to your point, no matter in all the war game scenarios of the Proud Prophet, and this was in 1983, no matter how nuclear war began, with NATO involved, without NATO involved, with tactical nuclear weapons, without tactical nuclear weapons, with China involved, without, no matter how it began, it ended only in one way: nuclear Armageddon. But would you like to close us out and say, because you, not to put you on the spot, but you are inside, you were inside, and you heard these discussions. How can you share with us in a general way what we can take with us to think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, most of the time when I've been involved with any type of simulation, it ends up exactly the way that Annie described, regardless of how it begins or whether you're using something referred to as a tactical nuke or something more strategic. So let me set that to the side. But I'll say this, and I'm probably in the minority for what I'm about to say. I can think of a situation, and I could lay one out for you, where I could see a nuclear-capable country using a very small nuke. I mean, Russia has, whether they still have them or not, but in the open media you can read, they had artillery shells and even mortar shells that would produce relatively small nuclear types of explosions in the battle space. And I could see a very dire situation, the loss of Crimea. They're going to lose Crimea in this ongoing conflict, where something like that at that scale was used to message the US and NATO about how serious they were about holding on to something that they saw was existential, which is Crimea and that warm water port. I think it's not unrealistic to say the United States and NATO and the rest of the world would be so freaked out by that use that we would do everything in our power to stop any type of escalation from happening. That's the good news. The bad news, though, that kind of gets back into how does this unfold over time is now you've broken that seal. Right. So what's to stop the next country from using one that's a little bit bigger? What's the new line now? It's been no use. Well, they used a mortar shell. Well, what if I use artillery type shell? What if I use a B-61 equivalent like you carry out an F-16, but I dial the yield way down? Is that, I mean, where does this go? And I think that's the danger. So I don't know that I can create situations where those tactical uses don't escalate very rapidly into nuclear conflict, but I think over time, the fact that you break that seal, it does disrupt deterrence at large and ends up in a bad circumstance.
So look, you didn't come here to get cheered up. So, so I'm going to end this one by thanking Annie for her book and for being here, and thanking General Moore. And then I'm going to read you a small passage, because I've never done one of these before. I've always wanted to read the dramatic passage.
This is where you're auditioning for your podcast, and we like this.
You're going to be on our podcast next week, Annie. So
no, I mean for the one that you're going to do with 156 films.
That would be good.
Yeah.
I'm serious about that.
Okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So on page 269, apes on a treadmill, and Amy and Hans will know this. One day in 1975, Foreign Policy magazine published an essay written by a defense official turned nuclear disarmament advocate named Paul Warnke, whose grandson works at the State Department, by the way. This essay, called Apes on a Treadmill, remains prescient to this day. In it, Warnke criticized not only how insanely dangerous nuclear weapons are, but how wasteful the entire nuclear arms race is and always has been. He called it a monkey see, monkey do phenomenon, with all participants copying one another's aggressive moves and getting absolutely nowhere, like unintelligent beasts. Even worse, Warnke points out that the runners in the race didn't seem to realize that there was no way for any one person or any one group to actually win, that we are all apes on the treadmill, slaving away, the visual seared in people's minds, and the article faded from view. Well, we're now no longer shielded from the view, Annie. The book is going to put it right in front of us.
You got to read. keep reading. There's one.
No, I don't want to ruin it for the good stuff here. You want to tell them? So Annie then goes on and does some research about actually people put apes on a treadmill with oxygen masks, and even the apes are smart enough to realize that they're not getting anywhere and they want to stop.
Not only that, they hit the button. Apes hit the button.
Apes.
To get off the treadmill.
So let's hoping we evolve that far one day. Join me in thanking Annie for